in the next 5 minutes, we're going to get up close and relevant with Mr. Greg Maloka, also known to myself as Boss Man, right? My former boss, actually, Clarissa, so the tables have shifted here slightly. Good to see you, Greg.
Good to see you guys.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Lovely to be here.
Well, if you're not familiar with Greg Maloka, where have you been? Not only was he a founder and member of and ultimately general manager of a popular youth radio station YFM, but following his tenure at Y, he partnered with research and trends agency Instant Grass for just over 3 years. And from 2007 to 2020, Greg served as managing director of Kaya FM, where he led a team that consistently grew the revenue and shareholder value of the business. Under his leadership, Kaya won Commercial Radio Station of the Year for a record 4 times in 5 years. And describing himself as a true Afropolitan, Greg believes that Africans of all kinds are shaped by their motherland. Coupled with that, as a collector, his love for the arts is not only visible on the walls of his home and office, but it's also evident in the many ways that he supports artists, both personally as well as professionally. Oh, we're excited to speak to you, Greg, and so much to unpack right around this conversation.
Yeah, good to be here.
Indeed. But
Yes.
I guess tying it back to the theme of relevance and, of course, your role as a cultural activist, many might actually ask culture and its relevance in this particular day and age in marketing. What's the interlink there?
It's pretty simple to me, Googs. And how you doing? Chap of chaps. You good? You know, culture is a way of life. It's how people live. It's what people do. You know, and when you understand the people that you were talking to and you understand how they conduct their lives, how their society is formed, you know, how they're socialized and how they want to change that socialization and how you can influence positively some of those changes is what makes you relevant, right? Because you've got to have a deep understanding of you know, the people that you're talking to, and that's rooted in culture and way of life.
You know what's beautiful about that is that we witnessed it. Just as you greeted Kolisa this morning, you said, Eita, not hey, Mr. Teshana. So that tells us something, right? It's a practical example of what you're describing.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of corporates, you know, have to find this challenge of, you know, you have to reflect the society within which you live in. You know, when we were at YFM, for instance, we were talking to ourselves. You know, we were young people, you know, about 20 odd years ago, talking to other young people. So it was pretty, you know, it made it easier for us to, you know, kind of figure this whole thing out together. And similarly, you know, when we ended up at Kaya, what was for me, you know, an even more bigger blessing was that, you know, you're working with people who you grew up with. So you understood the people. So when you spoke to marketers, you weren't introducing them to, you know, people you didn't know, right? Or lifestyle you weren't familiar with. And I think it's very important from, you know, just how corporates are structured, you know, to reflect the society within which they exist.
Yeah.
It's actually quite interesting. I remember the first time I met Greg, you were the most unprofessional sounding person I've actually ever heard. But interestingly enough, it made me feel very comfortable as a young person that was within that crowd.
Yeah.
And I suppose what I'd love to know from you, Greg, is it's one thing to observe the people that you are communicating with, but it's another thing to really be aware of the changes that are happening and be at the forefront of those changes. So when I think, for instance, of the pioneering story of YFM, when I think of the pioneering story at your tenure at Kaya FM, in terms of then broadening, you know, your offering to the lifestyle. We know that you guys had trips that you took together, things that are not traditionally radio. How are you able to really identify those before they happen and be at the forefront of them and take people along with you?
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, it goes back to, you know, when you have an intimate understanding of the people you speak to, you also get to know the things they miss and what they would like to experience and what they were prevented from experiencing, right? Because, again, we can't ignore the South African setting, you know, just what our history is and where we come from. And therefore, certain industries will always either do well or struggle because of a particular type of socialization. I think the critical thing here is to understand, you know, if you're looking in the tourism space, for instance, and, you know, research comes out and it says, oh, well, you know, black people don't travel, you have to remember that, well, they weren't allowed to get into certain places. And so how do you create, A, a reason for them to go to those places, B, content that's, you know, proper and sufficient for them to go and actually enjoy themselves, as opposed to kind of trying to fit into a space that isn't designed for them. So it's very important to, you know, understand those dynamics, and that's what kind of makes you understand what's around the corner, but it actually really is in front of you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of what's around the corner, I'm going to ask you to throw a couple of bones, maybe look into a crystal ball. But what we often find, Greg, when it comes to predicting the future, or trying to influence the future, is that sometimes we just tag and hang on to sexy phrases in the marketing space without fully immersing and understanding what they actually mean. And Afropolitan, for instance, is one of those phrases that sometimes is misconstrued or misunderstood. But in redefining the future, how do we make sure that when we align ourselves to these themes and concepts, that we fully immerse ourselves within them?
Two things. The idea of Afropolitan was not, you know, a bunch of men in afros, because I wouldn't qualify. You know, Afropolitan is really about the color of your heart, right? Are you invested in Africa from wherever you are? Like, you could be, you know, out in the UK, or you could be, you know, in the US. But are you invested in Africa? Do you see, you know, your future and the future of your offspring being in this space, and are you contributing to it positively? That's what makes you Afropolitan. It's not what you look like, right? It's seeing Africa from an African perspective, and seeing the world from an African perspective, and contributing as such.
So beautiful in that messaging. And as you say, it's not about what you look like, but what's in your heart in terms of its color, the messaging, and the passion points that stand true to it. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. It was lovely to see you guys.
Always good, Greg.
All right, cheers, guys.
We should be saying Sharp Fere, because that's what we relate to.
Really? Yeah.